So good afternoon, and thanks again for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Through our Alumni Exchange Series, we work to bring our alumni and friends a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, and we'll go ahead and put it in the chat, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon as we are joined by UIC alumna, Meghna Bhat. Dr. Bhat received her PhD in criminology, law, and justice from UIC with a specialization in gender and women's studies. She is passionate about using, creating, and producing films and cinema and storytelling tools to create social change and community dialogue. Today, Dr. Bhat will lead us through a discussion and teach us why and how to implement storytelling to improve conversations. We're very excited that she's here with us today to tell her story and lead us through this interactive discussion. Thank you, Dr. Bhat, for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the program.
Thank you so much, Karen, Catherine, Jessica, Wendy, and the UIC Alumni Exchange team for this warm welcome and wonderful opportunity and support to make this presentation happen. I'm also very honored to be here virtually reconnecting with my UIC Chicago community, and I know our participants are from different cities and states, but I believe our roots are always in Chicago in the UIC campus. And I've spent a majority of my life as a first-generation immigrant, so I honestly don't think twice when I'm being offered an opportunity to virtually be or reconnect in person with our campus community. So again, just to introduce myself, my name is Meghna Bhat. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from Sacramento, California. The area of Sacramento was and still is a tribal land of the Nissenan people. I would like to acknowledge that I am standing on the tribal lands of Sacramento's indigenous people. So with that being said, today I'll be just talking, giving you a quick overview of what I intend to cover today, right? Just learning about how to write, share, or facilitate stories. How do you say, it has its own learning process, right? I'm still learning. It needs time, patience, consideration. So what I'll be giving you a preview today, it's like a storytelling 101, but in terms of what, why, how, and where to use storytelling. So keeping in mind the time and to ensure that we have some time in the end with question and answers for, if you have any other questions, I want to be mindful today that what is being shared today is not an exhaustive list. It does not, and I may not have the opportunity or the capacity to explain storytelling or the width, breadth, nuances, and layers of storytelling, right? But I will provide some resources at the end for you to take away with you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. So, I usually also would like to additionally introduce myself as a storyteller by adapting one of the oldest beautiful ways of writing a poem or a story. And usually it starts with the prompts I am, and I have blanked out on the person who had actually written it. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to give credit where it's due, but it's not my idea. But I definitely wanted to introduce myself again in this way. And I hope you also feel inspired if you would like to share a little bit about yourself in the chat. If you feel comfortable, feel free to put it in the chat. So I am a first-generation immigrant from the chaotic city from Mumbai, India, living in the US for 17 years. I am a daughter of a school teacher in India and a self-employed entrepreneur. I am an older sister to a brilliant, compassionate, kind, and amazing sister, one of the best things that have happened in my life. I come from the land of spices, chai, street food called chaat, garam masalas, coconut water, and sugarcane juice. I come from the city of Sacramento in California, living as an immigrant in the city of trees and sunny weather. I come as a foodie, a cinephile, an amateur acrylic artist or painter, a brisk walker, and a dancer. but I may have two left feet, who knows. I come as a storyteller trained in oral and digital storytelling for the past few years. As Karen introduced me, I'm also an independent. I come as an independent gender and social justice consultant, scholar, educator, and speaker. And last but not the least, I come as a preventionist of gender violence and social injustice who would like to use storytelling and film to create social change, right? So these are the different ways that I wanted to introduce myself and to show, give a quick audio description of the pictures. That's me with the karate nunchucks. I watch Bruce Lee films a lot with my dad growing up. He loves Bruce Lee films, and I still watch a lot. And this was just, I did a few classes, but I'm not really an expert. This is just more like a show off. That's with my younger sister, and those are my parents. So I just wanted to give a visual image as well to what my story or my background is, and just to remind myself of how grateful I am of my roots and how, where I'm grounded in, right? Which land I'm grounded in. So there's something about this quote that every time I read, I keep interpreting it in a very different, beautiful way, unpeeling and unpacking every layer of storytelling. And I know maybe we may not have much time to unpack this now, but I just definitely wanted to share it with you, right? Stories move in circles. They don't move in straight lines. So it helps if you listen in circles. There are stories inside stories and stories between stories. And finding your way through them is as easy and as hard as finding your way home. And part of the finding is getting lost. And when you're lost, you start to look around and listen. Every time I read it aloud, I don't know, I get goosebumps because I'm kind of like unpacking it in my different roles, right? As a first generation immigrant, a survivor of gender violence, now an advocate and a preventionist, as a daughter, as a partner. So in these different hats that I wear, I keep unpacking this of what storytelling could look like. But when we talk about stories, what do we mean by stories, especially in today's context? I wanted to give a little framing of what storytelling looks like. What are we talking about, right? Storytelling has become a buzzword, right? For its, of course, it's amazing benefits, which we will talk in a few minutes. But I also want to urge everyone today, and including myself, I want to urge myself as well, to see storytelling as more than a buzzword, right? To challenge ourselves to explore the process in our own unique, comfortable, and safe way. So these stories are basically, when we talk about storytelling, is defined as true and personal narratives. They are the lived experiences of an individual or group, right? And it's usually, not usually, but it is said in a first person voice. So these are the three things that I definitely want to frame here today. What storytelling is not. It is not a substitute for therapy or counseling. It may be recommended as a form of therapy or counseling, but not a substitute, right? So I want to be mindful of that. I constantly remind myself as well every day. Also, when we talk about storytelling, these stories doesn't mean we share a story that was witnessed or experienced by someone else as our own, right? It may be well-intentioned, we may not remember, we are excited to share the story because we were inspired, and that's amazing, but it's just being mindful in the process. We could use that story shared with us by someone else as a reference point about something that we learned, a hurdle or milestone we accomplished or overcame, reflecting on our own lives. So just to be mindful that these storytellings, when we talk about true and personal narratives, we have to be mindful that it is in our own first person voice. These are lived experiences we are going through, especially when the stories are sensitive or have been requested as confidential, right? So with that framing, I do have a polling question, as I would like to know our audience as well. Thank you. How familiar are you with writing and or sharing stories with others? see people participating. Thank you. Yeah. So we have about 57% who said you're familiar with storytelling. You have either, you're familiar with writing and or sharing story with others. 19% said very familiar. 10% of them said so-so or not familiar, and 5% said clueless. I appreciate each one's transparency and time in participating in this poll. As with any polling questions, there's no right or wrong answer, right? I just wanted to know about our amazing audience here who's been present here for this session. So thank you for this poll. We have another polling question, and I'm curious to know, what is your intention with storytelling? Okay. I see people still replying. And you may select all the answers to the poll. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, David. Absolutely. And feel free to, put in the chat if there is more than one option that you are thinking of, or all the options as you mentioned. So I appreciate that. Awesome. So now when the poll is ended, and I see 48% of you said that you, wish to be a storyteller, or you are a storyteller. That's amazing. And then 43% said you would like to learn about storytelling and bring it to your workplace or organization. And about 5% said that you would like to bring storytelling in your communities, or you would like to facilitate these story circles, right, in your community and other public spaces. So thank you once again for participating in the poll. It's always great to know, where our participants are from in terms of your knowledge or background about storytelling. So when I talk about why storytelling, I mean to say is, why do we need storytelling in our lives, right? And this may seem such an obvious response to this question, but I usually like to identify, why do we need storytelling in our lives? What are the benefits? And this list, again, may be, it's not exhaustive. It may look different in your role, in your community, in your organization. So I definitely want to highlight some of the ones that, Story Center, which is an organization in Berkeley and where I trained, they have put this collection of research and documentation to show that, basically demonstrate that storytelling does have these amazing benefits. It not only increases empathy, it affirms our values, improves mental and physical health, but more importantly, on a collective level, it also can change or influence public policy and leads to narrative and culture change, right? So when I see benefits of storytelling, I'm looking at it as a preventionist in terms of the socio-ecological models. Like on the individual level, I personally found storytelling really helpful, that, basically it affirmed my values. It helped me to find my own voice that I didn't know was important or I had, right? And then you see through, between your relationships, between your communities, it helps in community building, increases empathy, and, physical and mental health. And on a larger collective level is influencing public policy, right? Or changing institutional norms, changing institutional practices that have been oppressive, for example. And also narrative and culture change. So increase in representations in our stories, in the mainstream media, or in general in our, in our lives, right? Stories have been used as tools for education and advocacy. It has kept participants engaged and inspired, right? Help them bond with each other. So these are some of the, benefits that I wanted to highlight. But I do have a question for our audience. And if you could please type it in the chat, I'm curious to learn from you as well. So what are some of the other advantages that I have not covered in that list, that you feel like storytelling can be helpful, right? What are the other benefits of listening to or sharing your true personal stories? So feel free to take a couple of seconds to type your response in the chat. And I'm going to give it a couple of seconds. If not, I'll go ahead, and then Karen, maybe we can highlight it in a few slides. Okay. Oh, people are writing. Oh, thank you, Catherine. More effective during job interviews and networking conversations. Great. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next slide, and I will come back to your chat responses. So it gives you a couple of seconds to process. I know I always take a few minutes to process, right? So we'll come back to your chat. So please feel free to type your responses in the chat. So one of the things that I want to highlight is how to write or share stories. I'm always asked, okay, like we have learned what is storytelling and why storytelling, but now how do we start the process, or what would the next steps be? Like if you're especially new to it, right? New to the process. So before I share a couple of ideas and strategies to write your own stories, here are some types of storytelling approaches or methods. Again, not an exhaustive list, and in fact, they may overlap with each other or used interchangeably. You have audio, you have written, you have digital, you have video in terms of visual, but no words. Digital includes components of audio and visual. And again, as I said, it can be used interchangeably and may overlap with each other. Before I go to the next slide, I want to pause and see if there are any chat responses that I am seeing. Yeah, let me see. Oh, wow, there are. Thank you, everyone. I'm seeing is David has mentioned the better I do sharing stories, the more comfortable it makes the other person to share the experience. Absolutely. Greg shares learn experiences for capturing the stories of others, like elderly family members. I love that. I always insist of like capturing storytelling as, to capture the intergenerational wisdom and legacy, right? Like to bond with our generational, especially elderly family members. Focus on getting the heart of a listener to move them to act. Thank you. And when it comes to using your story during jobs, higher education, we see another aspect. Great, and that you can't see through their GPA. Enhance ancestry history, and then connecting with your audience when facilitating a workshop. Absolutely. So thank you. Yes, and Kristen, I appreciate you mentioning that it helps us see as an individual, right? Humanizes them. And we come to know we have more shared human experiences than different, even though we are from different backgrounds and everything. So I am so grateful for each one of you sharing, and I still see some more responses about, making the client relatable in court and helps you remember the person in a unique way. So I appreciate you all sharing your responses. Feel free to type it, even though we may not have, we may not come to it, but thank you so much. So with that being said, so as I mentioned, people always ask me, like, how do I write a story? I'm completely new. What would be the first step? Because it can get very overwhelming when you hear other people's story and you're like, oh my God, they've done, I used to do that and I still do that. But I don't encourage people to think that, like, oh my God, their story, they said it in such a great way. They have such a great story. I don't have a story. But that's like the biggest, I would say, injustice you're doing it to your own story and your lived experiences, right? So these are some questions that will help kind of process it. And I hope it's helpful in terms of at least dodging your memory in terms of what you want to write, what story you want to write. So for example, these questions always help me, whether it's digital storytelling or writing a story for an essay or a journal or only for myself, right? It explains the process. So for example, what's the story? If I have a story or a couple of stories and I don't know what to talk about, these are the questions that will be helpful to shape what you want to share. So what's the story? Who do you want to share it with? Why do you want to share the story? And why share the story now? I want to pause for a second. I know there's a lot of words out there in the slide and what I've been sharing, but I want to give it a second to process, right? I have come to storytelling workshops or spaces or trainings where I'm like, I have like 3 stories. I don't know which one to share. Each one are connected with each other. And this is something, this process, which has been created by Story Center, has been always helpful for me to identify the process of narrowing down one story, right? And one of the things that I definitely encourage is writing a script of 250 to 400 words of what the story is about. So now you'll be like, oh my God, like what does a script look like? Just to let you know, the script does not have to be perfect. Do some free writing, whatever's in your mind, write it like you're journaling, no filtering, forget grammar mistakes, anything. Trust me, there are times where I'm like, oh my, 400 words seems a lot. And I've come up with a story of 700 words when I do free writing, right? It's always a process. What I would suggest is when you draft and then you start editing, doing your first edits, think of the sights, sounds, smells, sensations, or objects that are relatable to that story, right? Or any dialogues or a person that was in that conversation, that moment or a chapter or a conversation or a dialogue with someone that you want to capture in your story. It doesn't have to be, how do you say, like a whole life story, right? So that transformational moment could be joyous, could be funny, could be sad or horrifying. It could be something about grief. It could be scary or just something that you feel will be helpful for people to connect with you, right? That will help you to edit the script and avoid any repetitions. So avoid academic or business terms or languages, right? Especially if it's a personal story. My first story when I wrote, it was almost like I was writing an academic paper and I had to like remove my, hat off. And I'm like, Meghna, be a human being, be a storyteller. This is not an academic, this is not a paper testing your academic research writing skills, right? So I know it's a hard shift. It comes with practice, it's a process, so don't be hard on yourself. Anything that I'm sharing right now, I hope you're able to hold that storytelling process with grace and compassion for yourself, right? So just to give you an idea, if you wish to add and if you want to make it a digital story, you could add images, voice, videos, or you could just share your story with a trusted adult, or you could write it only for yourself, your own growth and healing. You don't have to share it with anyone else. But that will be one of the first baby steps. I encourage everyone to do that, right? So I hope this break, like this kind of breaking it down is not very overwhelming. I see myself like what would be less overwhelming for me if I'm learning something new, right? And it always helps to take apart these steps and spend some time to show you that this is not a difficult process. It's a matter of practice to kind of evolve as a storyteller. But the first draft and your story and your voice is important, right? The story comes with that and it will shape up, trust me. So with that being said, digital storytelling, I did want to give a definition of that it's a short first-person video narrative created by combining recorded voice, still and moving images, and music or other sounds. There are 7 steps of digital storytelling that I won't go into details right now, but if you do check out Story Center website, as I said, some resources that I'm sharing later, I would definitely encourage you to check out their free web conferences and webinars that they offer, kind of giving you a preview of just digital storytelling, right? But it's all about owning your insights, your emotions, right? Owning your story. The 7 steps is basically about the process. And I definitely encourage any story circles, any story circle process. It should be facilitated by a trained storyteller. I definitely encourage that, right? So just to give you a very, very brief preview of what that process looked like. Story circles is an important piece of any storytelling process. I remember as the only international international brown graduate student during my master's in Philadelphia, in a criminal justice class. I was feeling so invisible. I was feeling so unseen, right? I was completely like lost in the back. I was sitting in the back. I didn't know a new country, a new culture, a new educational system. And one of my professors actually held his class in story circle form. We didn't sit back to back like a regular traditional classroom. We actually created a story circle. And I'm so grateful to him because he's a restorative justice practitioner. He uses a lot of story circles for creating with like families and communities. So that's one of the most important sacred elements of storytelling. And that helped me a lot as a really shy introvert graduate student, having my space and moment to share my insights in a classroom, right? So when you're thinking of bringing storytelling in your circles, communities, and of course, bringing a trained and an experienced facilitator, I definitely believe that each of the storytellers will feel heard, seen, visible, and respected in these spaces. I know story circles are going to look different in virtual spaces over Zoom. It still doesn't have the same element, but trust me, there are ways of still encouraging and creating that practice in virtual spaces. And it's still a beautiful experience being heard, no interruptions, feeling respected, and again, feeling seen, right? But I definitely, before I go to the next slide, I definitely want to highlight or reiterate the fact that the practice of holding story circles are grounded in restorative justice practices, but it's originated in Native American and Indigenous community practices, right? So when we hold them, what I have learned, and I'm still learning, is that it's always important to not co-opt or colonize it, how we have done, for example, for a yoga or chai or, in our mainstream societies, is decolonizing it, right? Like giving, it is often well-intentioned, but to not co-opt story circles, right? To acknowledge, learn the history of how the story circles came from, Native American and Indigenous community practices, and giving the credit where it's due of how to hold these story circles in the most authentic way. So that's something definitely I wanted to highlight. And as I said, I'm still learning. So this is something that I'm sharing as a peer, not as an expert. So I hope this is helpful. So this is a short digital storytelling film. I just want to give a little bit of context quickly. Is a short digital film that I co-created in a workshop at Story Center. As I said, it's a nonprofit organization in Berkeley, California. It was me who provided the content, story, vision, and images, but it was a visual woman artist who I was paired with, who provided life to my story with her brilliant, creative, beautiful visual elements, right? And the stories of home, if this is something that you're interested, especially because this project is focused on immigrant and refugee women. And now they have expanded it to other immigrant and refugee individuals of all identities, right? So that's something which I definitely wanted to give you some context about this. So let me share the story. Give me 1 second. Oops. Can you all see the YouTube link? Okay. Let me know if you can.
Struggles and conflicts. I cannot believe it's been a year. We weren't a perfect family. We had our share of struggles and conflicts. I loved spending so much time with you since mom and dad worked full-time. Ai, mak bhook lagla, I would say after returning from school. You told me, how tugal karte kade doodh kella. I happily sat and enjoyed my lunch. You knew me so well. I was not a fussy child. If you didn't have time to cook, I was at peace with this favorite dish. It was our tradition until I left for college. Remember, when we traveled to Mangalore, our native place in Karnataka? We took a Volvo bus from Mumbai for Akka's wedding. I held your hand as I watched the villages flash by through the window. No wonder I got the passion to travel. Every year for my birthday, you made gulab jamun, my favorite sweet. And every July, I have spent my birthday away from you. I missed you and craved it, especially this year. Dad told us you were married at such a young age, so you could not complete your education. Yet, you did your best to read English newspapers and ask us questions. You always motivated me and my sister to study. You believed in us. Your 2 granddaughters are now educated, independent women. How is life there? You asked me when I visited home from the US. Your eyes sparkled with curiosity. You were eager to see life outside India through my stories and photos. I know you were suffering and in pain the past few years. Even though I saw you on video chat for a few minutes a week before you left us, I regret not telling you in person how much I love you. We miss you, Ai.
You can see the slides back. Okay. Thank you. So I just want to give it like a second or so in terms of any reflections about the story. And it's not about like in terms of the process, in terms about the images, the visual elements that were used. To be honest, it was Maureen, the artist. As you see, the visual elements are like a diorama, right? You can see like the images being built. She actually gifted that to me at the end. And I didn't realize the amount of work she had invested in making my story come true until she gave me the diorama. And I was just blown away. And I still get like, when I look at it, I'm like, oh my God, she put in so much of effort. So I'm always grateful for her to bringing, my grandmom, my late grandmom into, in such a beautiful light, right? That I can still cherish her history and her presence and the memories that we have had. Thank you. And I'm not sure if I see a chat response. Is it Taniyat? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it, mispronouncing it. But yes, gulab jamun is my favorite dish as well. And you didn't see any hands picking up or putting down the visual objects. It was strictly us viewing the images without any distraction. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And there are other stories of home and other digital stories on the YouTube channel for Story Center. I know there are other organizations as well. This is where I was trained. That's why I like to share about Story Center. But I know there are some amazing organizations and agencies and groups that are doing storytelling in their own beautiful, unique capacity, right? So you may find these digital stories, no matter which organization, on YouTube or other, Vimeo or other channels as well, for you to kind of get an idea. Feel free to continue putting any reflections if you want in the chat. I appreciate giving me the presence or the moment, to hear my story. So in terms of other types of storytelling, I think I can, okay, there. Other types of storytelling, right? I know folks have come and told me that Meghna, digital storytelling, we would love to, but we just don't have the capacity or the funding or, staffing, or for example, in an organization, right? Or you're like, I personally cannot afford that, for example. But just to take a pause and take a step back, right? And to take a deep breath, there are other types of storytelling that show up in our lives, even without us knowing that we are actually storytellers, right? So that's why I gave some visual elements, for example, journaling journaling is also a form of storytelling. And if you cannot think of stories that you feel like, hey, I can pick up from my journal and I feel comfortable enough to create a story about that, whether I share it with anybody else, whether I put it on YouTube, I share it only with my significant other or my family, or maybe I just do it for myself and I don't share it with anyone, right? TED Talks, how many of us get hooked onto kind of like, we kind of get, our attention is completely taken away by TED Talks, especially when they share a story, right? For us, a story is something that brings us to other people, brings us closer to other strangers. And it's almost, as I said, increases empathy, makes us feel like as if we are living in their shoes and what it is to have those lived experiences. Some of these images, the middle one with the leaves is something that I'm learning. And the one with the painting here, which is watercolors, and this one, just to let you know, I am currently in a digital storytelling workshop, which includes art and technology. And we are learning to use a lot of not just watercoloring, but also art, photo editing applications, right? Image editing applications on my cell phone. So this middle thing is a thing of a fall tree, with the fall colors that I took in Sacramento. And I used a photo app to kind of create this different image of what it is, right? So if you have photos that you want to share, but you want to hold the confidential, like you want to keep it confidential, you don't want to show that person's face, these are some of the photo apps that you can be creative and still create a digital film if you want, right? And for example, open mic storytelling live events. I have also been trained in oral storytelling workshops by an organization called Capital Storytelling in Sacramento itself. And they, I participated in a live storytelling event in November 2019 in front of 150 people. That's something which I have to pinch myself and be like, really, did I actually share that? Did I really do that? So just to give you an idea about what it looks like, the storytelling can come in different ways, different forms. So where to use storytelling, right? Now, next steps is where do I use my stories? And I do want to be mindful of the time. So I am going to just ask you some of these important questions that you can take back home with you in terms of like, why do you want to use the stories? Where do I use it, right? Which story do I use in which avenue? So one of the questions you need to ask yourself is, what's the purpose? Is it asking for grant money? Is it personal growth or healing, intergenerational legacy and family bonding, or you want to historically document stories? What's the purpose? The second question is, who is your intended audience? Is it your family members? Is it grant funding organizations? Is it hiring team or work colleagues? Is it only yourself? It doesn't have to be anybody else. Or is it for a college application or a scholarship committee, right? Those are two important questions you ask. But the third one is what story you want to share. So stories should be brief, about one moment, one conversation, one transformative minute. It could be any of these that change the way you think, react, perceive, attitude, or outlook about something, right? It could be a funny thing that happened and that's always been in your mind. And for example, when you look at, I'm just saying, when you see like cacti or succulent and you're like, oh my God, I remember this funny story, where I fell on it and, all these thorns, I'm just giving an example, like thorns. So it could be any of these things, right? So I see my image is, the sun has come out. So give me 1 second. This is a thing with, as much as I love the sun. Yes, thank you. Can you see better? Okay. I almost look like I had a halo on my head, which was not a bad thing. But so anyways, thank you for letting me know. I also wanted to mention that, that sometimes when I joined storytelling, let me personally share that, right? Like when I joined storytelling, I was like, oh my God, this has to be about my whole life. And I had to remind myself, Meghna, this is not a Lifetime movie or a New York best-selling memoir at this point of time. And I'm not mimicking it, right? If you're still starting to share your stories, maybe someday it's possible. Who knows? That would be cool as well. But right now, this is not about my whole life. It's not a memoir. Maybe it will be a part of a memoir that I plan to write, right? But most importantly, your story should be true, personal, authentic, and unapologetic. That's something definitely I want to mention is own the story, own your experience and insights in that. So unpacking story writing. So, again, some of this is not an exhaustive list. These are some just prompts that, are always helpful to strike a conversation. And it always helps when you have people that you can, like friends, family, communities. It could be really fun. Like, what's your memory about your favorite home meal? And I'm always like, which favorite home meal? Because I have a zillion of them, right? Or what was your first experience of leaving home like? And again, as much as these prompts are neutral, it could be sometimes triggering for some people, right? So just to be mindful of that. And it's not a bad thing, but just making sure you have that emotional support for the storytellers if you're planning to bring it in your community. Picture story prompt is something like choosing an image from your cell phone, for example, and inviting them to share a story of the pandemic experience, right? Of what is not in the picture, who is it for, who is included in the picture, what happened that day in the picture. So selecting a photo and then just sharing from your cell phone. That could be an excellent icebreaker, right? So these are just some examples. I'm sure you all have much more creative ideas that, I would love to hear at some other point of time. So these are important considerations. I think I'm good with time, so I just want to take a quick pause because I know I went a little fast, and we will keep some questions till the end. So if you missed something, let me know. But definitely, I did see the chat. And Catherine, you said you did 2 interviews on StoryCorps to tell your story about mental health journey. Thank you. It was telling a story through us interviewing each other. Yes, I appreciate you sharing that. You're the second person who has told me. I was in another webinar at 1 a.m. actually today at the University of Philippines on storytelling. So as you see, storytelling has not worked for me. I'm like super excited. I didn't even need my 2 cups of coffee today. But yeah, Catherine, you're the second person who told me about StoryCorps. And as much as I've explored it, I definitely want to, check into it more further because I've heard the interview process is really cathartic and powerful. So thank you for sharing that. So in terms of important considerations, I want to make sure that we ensure ethical and trauma-informed storytelling spaces or practice, especially when you're thinking about bringing it to your community. This list is not exhaustive, and I highly recommend, attending a webinar, as I mentioned, a free webinar with Story Center, or even reaching out to me with any further questions to learn the intricacies and nuances of storytelling. But these are some things that I definitely want to share is, as I mentioned, that it's not a substitute for therapy, right? And when we are in story circles is to honor the stories, active, deep listening, and giving supportive feedback, right? Asking if you are holding a story circle or you're a part of a story circle and you're like, I'm not prepared for feedback, but any, reactions would be great, right? So you can let them know what you are prepared for. Sometimes I'll be like, I would love to have feedback, and people will share feedback. That's something which Story Center has always promoted, is not saying, hey, your story missed this, or you should have done this, right? That's not the most constructive or healthy way. It's more like, for example, if Karen shared a story and you asked for feedback, I'll be like, Karen, if it was my story, I would focus on this aspect of the story to include it in the digital film, right? So something like that, right? It's respectful, is positive feedback, and apparently the sun is still out, which I just saw right now in my background. So anyways, in terms of the checklist is also, of getting that emotional support. So for example, as a storyteller or as a facilitator, if you're planning to facilitate story circle or any kind of storytelling activity, you have to be mindful that there could be people who may disclose traumatizing experiences, who may disclose something for the first time to this group, right? So whether you are able to provide emotional support, either having a counselor, or if you don't have that emotional support, giving them a list of referrals for agencies around you that they can reach out to if they want to seek help, right? So either way is letting them know that, hey, we don't have an advocate or a counselor on call, but we're giving you this list of referrals, right? To everyone, whoever's in the story circle. Something like that for them to take back with them, right? So that's why I said support. Second is accessibility. As I said, language accessible, encouraging people to share stories in a language that they feel most comfortable in. If you are bringing storytelling in your organizations and communities, we need to start from scratch one, or if you're writing grants about bringing storytelling, this is where you take a step back and you're like, hey, I need to ask for funding to get interpreters and translators because I want my storytellers to feel comfortable, in a language, or ASL, for example, right, to accommodate disability accommodation needs. So just keeping that in mind, if you do have a story circle in person in the future, just making sure that it's ADA accessible, right, the site, the space, everything. So just keeping some of these things in mind, because people will, with any form of disability or any form of challenges, are going to think twice if they don't have that accessibility of sharing their story. That's about building trust with them in the first step, right? The last thing I just want to highlight is that storytelling is not about a trauma or oppression Olympics, right? Sometimes we unintentionally do it. I'm not saying it in the in a negative or dismissive way. This is not meant to be that. Sometimes it's very easy for us to feel like, oh my God, people have got it worse, so my story is not important, right? Or to, kind of thing. I just again want to mention that each story is important, each voice is important. So it's sometimes the most simplest, smallest moments that can make it a beautiful, powerful story, right? So if you're a facilitator, if you're someone who is bringing it again, kind of just be mindful of not creating that culture, not creating that kind of setting when people are ready to share their stories. The last thing I definitely want to mention is mandated reporting. So I know when we bring about that in terms, especially if you're planning to bring storytelling among youth, minors, students, right? In terms, or any form of mandatory reporting, right? Whether you're in a university, in an organization, just kind of being aware of them, kind of letting your storytellers know, like if you disclose trauma, if you disclose something, who is the mandated reporter, kind of just checking out those intricacies, basically. So that's why it's always important having a trained storytelling facilitator and having that support system when you're thinking of that. And one last thing was not coercing, exploiting other stories, especially to hear about the underdog stories for branding and marketing, right? Unless the storytellers know what they are into, they know exactly what their stories are being shared for, and they have consented at every stage of that process. Their consent can change from sharing the story till the end, saying that I don't want to be using, my story in a campaign, for example. Right? They have the right, and it's just about respecting that right. I'm almost done, and just a few takeaways. But before I speak about the takeaways, if you have any questions that you want to put in the chat, or maybe later on, I don't know if there's a possibility of unmuting, feel free to ask me. I will be sharing my contact information in a bit, but just take a few seconds to kind of process that and see if you have any immediate questions for me. But in terms of recap or takeaways or just important reminders, and some of this may be duplicate information that I may have already shared, but I definitely wanted to reiterate that, right? Someone joined late. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page. Storytelling is not a substitute, as I mentioned. It can be a part of a therapy or counseling by a certified counselor, but not a substitute. Ongoing consent and readiness as a storyteller. They may change their mind anytime to not share a story outside the story circle, right? It could be only for them. And it's all about respecting that and asking them their consent, their authorization, and respecting their readiness to share a story. It's okay if you write your story only for yourself. That's amazing. The fact that you're starting with writing your stories and you're the only audience, that's so cathartic. That's so life affirming and validating. So if that's your first step and you're like, I may never share it for anyone else, that's beautiful. That's absolutely fine. But if it's helpful, if you do plan to write stories, which is trauma, which has elements of trauma or any negative triggers, I definitely encourage you to seek your support system or seek help if you feel distressed, right? Because these, as much as storytelling is cathartic, it can bring up elements of thoughts that, may be triggering, may be unpleasant. So just make sure you take care of yourself, right? Drink water, stretch, reach out to your loved ones, talk to your therapist, whatever that may look like. I do that, and that's why I always encourage other people to do that. Facilitate ethical and trauma-informed storytelling. Do not share other stories outside your story circles without their consent, especially, right? You may even, for example, if I want to like, okay, you can share my story, but don't mention my name or give any identifying information. But the storyteller should be giving you that consent. That's absolutely important. And anonymity and confidentiality, there are ways of writing these stories in an anonymous voice and maintaining the confidentiality. So not only what the story is shared in that circle stays within the circle, right? But it's also keeping that confidentiality. So you can get a digital story recorded in a voice, but not put your name on that. It can be by anonymous. You don't have to put any pictures that identify you or put any information. That's perfectly fine. And last but not the least, one of the things that I love doing is attending virtual in-person story slams, moth events. If you're in your car driving, you hear moth storytelling events. I definitely encourage you to listen to them. It always inspires me to bring out different elements of storytelling. I know we have about 5 minutes, so I want to be mindful, but feel free to write any, list one thing that you have learned or are taking away from today's session. I would love to hear that. If this is something that you're like, I'm not ready for an answer, I just want to take it with me and I'll think about it later, that's no problem at all. So please, I'm not pressuring anybody to process it right now. But definitely I would love to hear what is one thing you learned and are taking away from today's session. These are some resources. As I said, we are all storytellers. I'll come back to the responses on the chat if there are any. I am definitely available. My website is meghnabhat.com and I will share my email in a second. I am a trained digital storytelling facilitator. I'm constantly learning. I have done a train the trainer session for the Nevada Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence earlier this year in my own culturally relevant way, right, with the advocates there. I'm absolutely open to having any discussions of collaborations. Story Center is there. Capital Storytelling is where I did oral storytelling. They're having virtual classes right now, so you can still join them even though it's based in Sacramento. And there are some of these other, which you will get it in the handout, the slide handout. So you can click on that and they're all hyperlinked. Ada Cheng was a from UIC community member. She does some amazing storytelling work. I would definitely encourage you to check out. She's an amazing colleague in storyteller. So she's Chicago based, but I know she does some wonderful work out there. With that being said, I want to see if there are any questions, and then this is my contact information. And I see a few responses. Karen, it all back to you.
Meghna, thank you so much. I see people writing this too, but this has just been so inspiring. And I know that question wasn't designed for me, but the idea of what's one thing I've taken away, it's just that it generates emotions. When you shared your video story, I got a little teary-eyed because it really connected me to you and into the story you were telling. And so it's just very, very powerful. So thank you for walking us through this process. And we did have one question come in. I think I got a minute for it, so I'd like to try and ask you. I know you just shared that wonderful list of resources and websites. Is there a book if somebody is walking away and saying, oh, I'm going to be commuting on a train or just, and they want to just read some additional resources? Is there a particular book or resource you'd say this is the number one thing you should go look at? I don't know if there is a number one, but one you might recommend.
So I would definitely, so a couple of things. There are a few books at Story Center, like the founders have written, right, on storytelling process and digital storytelling. One of them was the 7 steps. I think it's like the digital storytelling cookbook, right? But in terms of if someone wants to reach out to me, I can send them a specific list with the hyperlinks because I don't want to misdirect them to something. But also oral capital storytelling, as I said, the organization on oral storytelling, they actually had this paid workbook that you can have as a storyteller that you can, explore like it's an interactive workbook that you can use. So there are different amazing resources, even as a book, that will be available there. I do have a couple of them here, but I definitely would love to email whoever is interested. If you reach out to me, I'll send you the list of a couple of those books that have been helpful, but I don't want to give wrong names.
No, thank you. Thank you for being agreeable to being that resource. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
And out of respect to the person that might have told you the story or shared the story, do you have one story that you think is the best story you've ever heard or that you've read that sort of you kind of center yourself back to thinking this is what the passion came out, and whatever that may be.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's a beautiful question. So I remember growing up with my mom being an amazing storyteller. She would share all these really funny, hilarious stories of all the possible mischief that her siblings were up to. And even though she was the oldest daughter, oldest sibling, she would share about her younger sister and another two brothers. And I remember listening to those stories like a zillion times by the time I was 10, but I still every time wanted her to share it again, because every time I would relive what it is to be in her shoes and just experience that, like what was it, to experience that mischief, at the older sister who was troubled and cornered to a room with all the mischief that she was seeing from her siblings. So every time she shared, like I know that I heard it like a million times by now, and for me that kind of inspired me, like, oh my god, I'm never going to be tired of listening to my mom sharing those stories, because just the way she shared, we would all burst into laughter, and we would always literally be in tears, laughing. So that's something which kind of inspired me. I mean, there are different stories, but of course, it's mainly the mischief that my uncles and aunts, who I've, seen them growing up, and now I'm like, oh my God, did they do that as a kid? Like that kind of thing. Did they drop eggs on a rug? Like, random things here and there, or their hand got stuck in the cycle gear, you name it. So it's just the mental images and the visualization I had of them that really inspired me always to think of storytelling. But more importantly, also as a survivor of gender violence, I felt like my story should be shared whenever I'm ready and whenever I have the capacity to kind of bring about that social change.
Oh, so inspiring on both ways. Thank you so much, Meghna. This has just been absolutely wonderful. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you sharing your story with us, but also this process with us. You are very inspiring, and we are very proud that you are a UIC alumna, and just very much appreciate all of your time today, and of course, continuing to be a resource. Just to close this out real quick, please join us for our next Alumni Exchange program on Wednesday, November 10th at noon Central Standard Time, when we will be joined by current UIC doctoral student, Catherine Howard. Catherine's research focuses on our attitudes towards diversity and how our political affiliation can impact our views. Please join us for this interactive discussion as she presents how conservatives and liberals view diversity differently. To find a recording of this episode or of our past episodes, please go to go.uic.edu/alumniexchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that brief survey I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you again, Meghna, for this wonderful presentation, conversation, and discussion. We are so grateful for you and for your time. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Alumni Exchange program. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Take care.